Okay, so um, looking here at page 536, figure 12, we're going to take the case of a temporary negative supply shock. Okay, so let's see, we're starting at point 1 here. Looking at step 1, temporary negative supply shock. Okay, so the classic case, oil shocks. Oil shocks. Okay, a little history. Go back to 1973. I hate to say it, the Arab-Israeli War, 1973. Israel almost lost that war. U.S. always a big supporter of Israel, and the Mideast countries that were fighting against Israel eventually decided to take retribution against the U.S., okay? Hate to say that's kind of what was going on. And at that time, as I said before, the U.S. was really heavily dependent on Mideast oil. We had, our cars were very inefficient, large, inefficient cars. We were not producing as much oil as we were using. All of a large percent was coming from the Middle East. Certain points of time, the Middle East was they were always operating as a cartel and supplying on oil. They decided to get back at the U.S. and decrease the supply of oil, which caused the price of oil to skyrocket. You had shortages. People had to wait in line to fill up your car. They had things like even license plates on one day and odd license plates on another day. Sort of a mess. So we have, as a result, the supply curve shifting to the left, aggregate supply, resulting in the worst possible case here now, when you have a supply, temporary supply shock. To the left, you get the worst possible outcome, which is a fall in output and an increase in inflation. Effectively, the supply curve is tracing out this section of the demand curve, okay? And as long as that keeps continuing, if the shortage keeps continuing, it's a terrible situation as it was at the time. Eventually, this output gap will result in a slack in the labor market, as you would get unemployment there, and then expectations of inflation would eventually fall, and wages would fall relative to inflation, and you would have a shift back in the supply curve until you arrived at sort of theoretically the original equilibrium point. Okay, so on page 538, we actually have the historical data of this supply shock to go along with our graphical theoretical analysis. And here you see we were at this equilibrium long run, equilibrium output. Remember, in the long run, we have our long run supply curve, our short run supply curve. They intersect at the same point where the aggregate demand curve intersects. So you have all three of these curves intersecting at the same point. So we start on point 1, 19, here, look at the data, 1973, unemployment 4.8%, very nice. Inflation 6.2%, relatively mild, So we have these two shocks, okay? 73, again, this was the year of the Yom Kippur War between the Arab world and Israel. Right after that, we had our first oil shock, right? Unemployment increased 5.5, 8.3. Inflation goes up to 11% here, backs off a little at 9%. And then, I guess the oil shocks subsided a bit. People started to shift away from large cars at that point, and that relieved some of the pressure. And I guess there was some accommodation by the Arab states again. But then you had back in 1980, you had another shock. This was, again, another period of Middle East unrest. Remember, that was, I don't know, you don't remember, but 1979 was the year that the hostages were taken in Iran. Again, another difficult period in U.S. Mideast relations. So again, we see unemployment increasing and inflation increasing. Very textbook examples of how these temporary supply shocks do significant damage to the economy. Okay. Okay, so now the text takes up the case of permanent supply shocks. Okay, and so first it discusses, since we were talking about negative supply shocks, temporary ones. What about permanent negative supply shocks? For example, permanent negative ones. So it's a little harder to come up with examples. But for example, they take the case of regulations, okay? They call them ill-advised regulations, but if you had an increase in regulations that negatively affected the potential output of the economy. So here we are, point one again, the intersection of our three curves. We have a supply shock, so negative, so the supply curve shifts to the left. And if, for example, regulations were increased and they were not lifted, then you could imagine a scenario where potential output, not current output, but actual potential output of the economy could fall. So that would be represented by a shift to the left of the long run aggregate supply curve. And when that shifts to the left, at each point we can draw our short run aggregate supply curve and get these intermediate equilibria with the aggregate demand curve. And we see that, again, we have this double whammy of reducing output and increasing inflation. So if these supply shocks are permanent, we can end up in a situation here where potential output has fallen and resulting in a permanent equilibrium here where the three curves intersect here at a permanently lower rate of output and higher rate of inflation. Okay, not a good situation, right? Fortunately, there aren't too many examples of that happening. Usually, okay, so looking on page 539, we have the more no, not 539. That was the same. Hold on. We just did that one. Hold on. Fortunately, we can find many more cases of positive supply shocks, okay? So, looking at this period from 95 to 99, we have two things going on. It's hard to believe. One of them, the one that's hard to believe is that healthcare costs were falling. It's hard to believe that was ever the case. Relatively. I mean, not in absolute terms, but relative to other costs, okay? That's the development of HMOs, okay? Although, we came to realize, most people, that HMOs didn't afford you the same quality of medical care. It did result in less costly medical care, okay? The other thing that's going on here is, of course, the computer revolution, okay? Really starts to take hold in the late 90s, okay? That just amazing of the increase of productivity, and you think of Windows 95. That was the really huge in personal computers operating system that really resulted in huge increase in the use of personal computers, but also, larger computers, of course, were continually being used. Big breakout there in computer usage. And so what happens there is potential output increases. This shift here in the in the long run aggregate supply curve, which going along with that would be our shifting of our short run supply curves, and as a result, we have the really favorable result of lower inflation, greater output. And we can hopefully see that in the data where the unemployment rate falling steadily and the inflation rate falling, not quite as steadily, but also falling. Remember, there's other things going on that affect the inflation rate. Okay. Okay, sorry about that, just looking ahead for a second. Okay, so finally we can look at a couple examples, historical examples of negative supply and negative demand shocks, okay? So for example, from 2007 to 2009, the Great Recession, the bubble, the bursting of the housing market bubble, okay? Let's see, we are starting off here, 0.1 intersection of the demand, short-run demand and long-run and short-run supply curves here at our potential output level and inflation level. So let's say 2006, 2007. Right, say 2006. nice unemployment, nice inflation, right? Low levels of both. That, of course, low level of unemployment means high level of output. So what happens here? 2007, we can see an increase in housing prices. I mean, let's see, 2007, 1 second, let me just check one thing here. Hold on for a second. I had to check my historical data. And so what's happening in 2007, we had a oil price shock, okay? So that caused the supply curve to go up, short run aggregate supply to increase, okay? So our initial equilibrium would be over here, and then in 2000 to 2008, we had the housing bubble began to burst, okay? Aggregate demand started to fall, okay? Housing prices started to fall. That resulted in the wealth of the consumer fell. Remember, the consumption function is first a function of income, but it's also a function of wealth. So as housing prices fell, consumption fell. You also had, housing prices fall so far that people went bankrupt. That's represented by a shift to the left in the demand curve here. And then, eventually further shift in the demand curve. Until finally, this lower level of output, potential output here didn't fall. So there's a lot of slack in the economy. Finally, the supply curve started to fall, and here we have output continuing to fall, but inflation falling also. So here we have first the increase in the shift to the left of the supply curve causes output to fall and inflation to increase. We can see that here. First, output doesn't fall, but inflation increases. So we can see that over there. Then we have unemployment increasing, output falling, and inflation increasing, maybe to this point. And then here we have a big drop, big increase in unemployment, big fall in output, all the way from here down to here. And a fall in inflation. From this level here, I think there was a 5.0 here, to around 0, and then actually negative. Okay. So, I guess this higher inflation rate here, increase in inflation here, we'll leave that for further historical research as to what caused that. But in general, you had a really nice situation here, but a much higher increase, much higher rate of inflation up to here, and the negative demand shock causes both inflation to fall and output to fall. Okay. Okay, so we have some more data here. We can look on page 544. The United Kingdom, Britain. The financial crisis over there. Initially, we're at this nice, in this long-run equilibrium here. And then they also were affected by rising oil prices, supply curve increases, inflation increases. You might say initially unemployment didn't increase, but shortly thereafter unemployment increased. So here you have your increase in inflation. Unemployment doesn't increase yet. You get to, starting in December 2008, unemployment increases. Still, inflation's increasing. But look what happens now. What happens in December, in the fall of 2008? Lehman Brothers goes bankrupt in September 9, 2008, which really starts off, the biggest part of the financial crisis. Unemployment goes from 5.3 to 7.8, and inflation here in December of 2008 goes from 3.9 to 2.1. So you start here and you work your way down to here. Very nice example of our theory working out. So finally, the final example in this chapter, page 546, shows the effect of the financial crisis on China. Look at that. Here's our nice who know that the Chinese economy could behave like the U.S. economy in certain aspects. The Chinese economy suffered the same effects of the financial crisis. What happened in China was we were in this equilibrium here. Income in the U.S. and other countries fell a lot. Unemployment increased up to 10%. Consumption fell. Our demand for exports fell. Okay? China's exports fell. Our imports from China fell, resulting in the demand curve in China falling down to here. And so we get this fall in output in China here, growth. This is not unemployment. This is growth. Output growth. Everybody works in China, I guess. Who knows? Output growth. I shouldn't say that. I should edit that. Output growth falls. Inflation increases. That's interesting how that happened. But here we have inflation falling. And apparently there was a massive stimulus package in China to increase output. So that initially we had Chinese exports falling, stimulus package going this way, causing aggregate demand to go back this way. So growth falling here, growth increasing here. Okay. Very good. Okay, so I hope now you're able to go through chapter 22 on your own and follow all these examples, etc., and all the mechanism. And, as I said, when you look at historical data, sometimes it doesn't match exactly with the theory because this is a model where we haven't taken into account all the factors. So it's a simplification to help us understand, the most important factors and as to take into account more of historical data, we would have to add to this model. Okay, thanks a lot.